Greetings, this is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at what has been happening in the news in regarding to the US, Russia, and China. You know, there were two recent summits, one between the US and China, and then the Russian president came to China just a few days after the US meeting between the presidents. So I'm just going to take a look at that and give some background to the relations between these three countries. I'll look at their economies, their military, briefly, just a general overview of the relations between these so-called major powers. So I'll begin by looking at the relations between China and Russia, I think it is, and also look at relations between China and the US. So, you know, China and Russia have the common ideology of communism, which I think was in Russia first and it came to China later on, even though their economies are no longer considered communist economies. So anyway, these are just some documents. I'll put them in the description of the program, the sources of the information that I read throughout the show. Following the establishment of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, China's ruling Communist Party moved quickly to establish official ties with its communist neighbor to the north, the Soviet Union. Throughout the early 1950s, the two countries enjoyed strong ties founded on the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance, a bilateral treaty which established a security alliance and facilitated significant economic, military, and technological aid and cooperation. That's interesting because I think as Russia is now at war with Ukraine, China, well, officially isn't providing any kind of military aid to Russia, even though this, what it's saying here, there was some kind of military alliance, security alliance. So I don't know if this part, I know there's a treaty which I'll mention later on between Russia and China, but it seems not to include security. But here, during the time of the Soviet Union up to 1990, there was some kind of security alliance between China and Russia. The relationship began to sour, however, in the mid-1950s, when an ideological rift emerged between Beijing and Moscow after the Nikita Khrushchev assumed leadership of the Soviet Union. Escalating the tensions resulted in a Sino-Soviet split, so the countries diverged basically. And it included in 1969 a military clash at Zhenbao Island, which nearly escalated the war. So the rift between the two countries was so severe that the Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, pursued normalization of relations with the US. So whilst they were aligned at one time, because China and Russia ideologically at least broke apart, or they had their own tensions, China moved towards the US, which I'll talk about more later on. So the tensions continued to simmer between the two communist powers until the 1980s. Imagine they're two ideological powers with the same ideology, but they broke apart. They had differences in their perceptions of communism, probably, or certain tensions between over land territories. Anyway, continuing, the relaxing of tensions led to the 1989 Sino-Soviet summit, in which Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev visited Beijing to meet with Deng and other Chinese leaders. And this summit was the first meeting of leaders of the two countries since the 1950s. And from there, that basically resumed the normalization of friendship between the two countries. So that's the background to what has been happening with China and Russia, how they broke apart over some territory, some island, and then later on they became aligned once more. Today they're very aligned, as the two main powers in the world are pushing against what you might call American hegemony, or American control of the global economy. In 1921, this is relating to the US now, In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was founded by a group of Chinese leftists based on the principles of Marxism and Leninism. This ideology is also influenced by the Illuminati, as I mentioned in the early program. Marx and Lenin and Engels, they read, well, at least Lenin and Engels read the Illuminati documents, or the Illuminati ideology. And this idea of a global community or global commune, I think, came from the Illuminati, even though the Illuminati itself also used to read earlier communist works. So in terms of political ideology, the Illuminati, you could argue, borrowed from the early communist thinkers, but in terms of their spiritual understanding of the world, in terms of man not being egotistical in focusing on family and nation and community, and instead focusing on some kind of global community of people, that came from the Illuminati, and it was also borrowed by the communists in terms of the idea about so-called some kind of global community. In 1921, as I was reading, the Chinese Communist Party was founded by a group of Chinese leftists based on the principles of Marxism and Leninism, forming a united front against the Kuomintang, or the KMT, and the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, claimed to be the true government of China. And before long, the Chinese Civil War began in August of 1927. The KMT gained control over most of southern China, claiming Nanjing as its capital. The US recognized the KMT. This is when the US first got involved in China. They got involved in China several centuries earlier. But under the current political systems that began to exist in China, they recognized the KMT in around 1927. So anyway, more recently, this is the relations between China and the US now. In 1980, Deng Xiaoping launched a series of economic and social reforms meant to improve the lives of Chinese citizens, including opening up China to foreign investment, recollectivizing agriculture, and allowing citizens to own businesses. International companies flooded into China. This is part of the stage where the Chinese began to, it says open up, they began to allow in American companies into the country, and also it's when the Americans began to share some of its technology with China, as well as they began to share technology with Russia. These are two regions in the world, I think, which the West saw as being okay to develop. So if they perceive these two areas of the world as areas that should be allowed to develop. Anyway, let me continue. From here, the two nations had more and more contact. President Ronald Reagan became the third US president to visit China in 1984. In the 1970s and 1980s, China joined a number of international organizations, including the IMF, the World Bank, and Asian Development Bank. China was finally engaged more with the international community. So here, mentioning the IMF and the World Bank, these are conceived to be American systems. They're global systems, but they're dominated by America. So China became part of these organizations. But China did things in its own way. It joined the World Trade Organization, but didn't behave in the way that the US expected it to behave. When it joined these organizations, it ran its economy in such a way that it could increase its exports abroad. So it's an export-orientated economy, which means it focuses its manufacturing and producing goods for export rather than goods for local consumption. This is an idea which many countries around the world didn't even America hasn't focused on that so much. China specifically focused on building its economy by making goods for export around the world, even though it did steal technology from the US in particular in the process in order so that it could compete with Western countries. So that's a brief look at the US-China relations and China-Russia relations. I'll mention the Russia-US relations in a while. Just looking basically at some of the different aspects of their societies. For example, or the global society, in terms of the military might, the US is the number one, then Russia, of the three, US is number one, Russia number two, and China number three. I'll mention that other countries going down to number 10. India is number 4 in the world. South Korea is number 5. France is number 6. Then Japan is number 7. The UK is number 8. Then Turkey and Italy. And even Brazil is at number 11, so Brazil seems to have a reasonable military. So China maintains its number 3 spot behind Russia for the 2026 review. It continues large-scale investment in its military and buoyed by a powerful industrial base, which is true, but even then it doesn't spend anything near what the US spends on military might and military infrastructure. And for China, Taiwan, as we all know, is a priority in terms of it regaining full control of Taiwan. And in number 2, this is Russia. It continues to double down on its efforts across eastern Ukraine, despite American attempts to a permanent ceasefire. Well, Russia wants a ceasefire, but on its own terms. It's not just America that wants a ceasefire. It's Russia wants a ceasefire. It wants peace for the people in eastern Ukraine, the Russian speakers or the ethnic Russians in the region. The reason it went into Ukraine in the first place was to secure that peace. But the West, although they're saying here that America wants permanent ceasefire and peace, in reality America wants the West to dominate that region or to take over that region and aggravate the Russians even more. Even though at the moment this current president will give the impression that he's no longer so much interested in the war, he's leaving it for the Europeans to fund Ukraine now. And he wants some kind of peace, but he wants it on the terms. You know, this current president of the US, his thinking seems to be different from the typical American presidents, even though much of the agenda is still the same. Being someone who's not a politician himself, although he's following the agenda of those who are financing him, his thinking, his ways of doing things, I should say, are slightly different. The United States military continues. This is supposed to be the number 1 military in the world. Continues its lead role on the global stage by showcasing the most powerful fighting force on the planet. It's the most powerful fighting force, but they failed to defeat the Iranians. They wanted to basically to defeat Iran and supposed to knock out all its nuclear facilities and nuclear power, nuclear weapons creating facilities, and also subjugate its military, which it has failed to do. Iran now controls the Strait of Hormuz, which is a major choke point for ships supplying oil and other goods around the world. The Americans have failed to stop them from blocking it. So, and even the American so-called warships, they have to stay thousands of miles away from Iran. They're supposed to be going to war with Iran, but the ships can't go anywhere near because they don't have the technology to stop Iranians from bombing their ships, even though they claim they have the best air defense systems in the world. Anyway, looking at the economic side now. In terms of nominal GDP, this the average way that you measure GDP, this is gross domestic product. GDP is measured by the amount of output a country can produce in terms of production and so forth. And America is number 1 at the moment. Its economy is 29.3 trillion in terms of GDP. China is next with 18.9 trillion. Then Russia's a bit far away. You have countries like Germany, Japan, India, the UK, France, Italy, and Canada are all above Russia. Russia's GDP is only 2.9 trillion, so it's nowhere near the top two. But it's still considered a major power because of its military. In terms of purchasing power parity, purchasing power parity is a way of measuring GDP, which is measures according to, for example, if you buy a loaf of bread in a Western country, you pay a certain price, but if you buy it in another, maybe global South country, or Russia or China, you'll get that same loaf of bread for a much cheaper price. Well, so all those salaries are lower in these countries than in America, for example. What you can buy for your money is either equal or more than you could buy in the US. The US salaries are much higher, but prices of goods are also much higher. So purchasing power parity looks at the purchasing power of a country's salary based on its own economy, rather than comparing what they earn in this global South country to what they can buy with that money in the US or a Western country. So it gives a better idea of what a person can spend their money on in their own country. And according to this way of looking at things, China's GDP is much higher than the US. The US comes second. China is 33 trillion. The US is only 25 trillion. Then you have countries like India, Russia is number 4 in this one. Remember in the previous it was around number 10, but here it's number 4. Then you have Japan, Germany, Brazil, and so forth. In terms of global trade and the currency that is used most, the dollar is still the dominant currency. It's still used for something like 80% of global trade. The euro is used for around 20%. Then you have the Japanese yen and the British pound. The Chinese yuan is still quite small. It's nowhere, probably around 7% or less. Even though China says it wants to increase the use of the yen in global trade, so it wants to transform its economy so that it plays a greater role in the global economy, or its currency plays a greater role in the global economy. Looking at China-US relations, this China-US summit that took place last month, in April I think it was, there was no real, according to what journalists are saying, there was no real benefit to the US, or no solid agreement was signed. Some agreements were signed, but there was no solid agreement trade agreement that was reached. And also no joint communique was issued. Normally after such a summit, the two leaders signed some kind of joint statement, but no joint statement was made between the two leaders for the public to hear. The US concessions fell short of Chinese expectations. Contrary to what many Chinese observers had hoped, the United States made no substantive concessions to the Taiwan question. Basically, Chinese Chinese continued to push, basically. I remember seeing something in the news about the Chinese president made it clear that Taiwan was part of China, and the US are not really supposed to interfere with the aspect of their friendship. Phrases such as the US not supporting Taiwan independence, opposing Taiwan independence, or supporting China's peaceful reunification did not appear, nor was there any US commitment to reduce arms sales to Taiwan. So I think basically the status quo, there was no change on the Taiwan issue in some ways. Chinese purchase orders also fell short of US expectations. China purchases of American agricultural products did not significantly exceed previous levels, and China agreed to purchase only 200 Boeing aircraft rather than the 500 previously rumored. Maybe the 500 was just an hopeful figure, but maybe the news wasn't going to reach 500, but they had to put out something there. Maybe if they hadn't put out the 500, China would only agree to probably less than 200. So putting a high figure out there probably encouraged the minds of the Chinese to purchase more than they would have. Finally, U.S. restrictions on high-tech exports to China remain unchanged. Although they have agreed to export some electronic goods to China for certain reasons or certain inputs into certain products. There were some commercial agreements regarding China's purchase of American agricultural products, civil aviation aircraft and crude oil, and the United States pledged to provide China with civilian aircraft components and engines helpful to stabilize expectations surrounding bilateral economic and trade ties. So they agreed. It's not that the US has completely blocked all exports to China. There are certain essential items that they would still provide because there are certain things they want from China itself. They're like these rare earth minerals that go into components for aircraft and military hardware, which can only come from China. So the US has to make some kind of agreement in order to obtain those items. The two countries agreed to establish trade and investment councils to deal with routine bilateral trade and investment issues, which could help prevent the escalation of frictions and promote cooperation. But even if you have these trade and investment councils to discuss these bilateral issues, the current president can easily blow up those agreements if something happens and he disagrees. He will go to the media to make his declarations rather than sit in some kind of meeting. The two sides expressed willingness to cooperate on international issues. They expressed willingness to strengthen communication and cooperation on a wide range of issues, including promoting a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, work towards a reopening the Strait of Hormuz, preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and managing the risks associated with artificial intelligence. In terms of the Strait of Hormuz, it's the US that caused the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz if they had not attacked Iran in the first place. So the US is seeking assistance with China to open the Strait of Hormuz, yet it's the US that caused the problem in the first place. In terms of the Russia-Ukraine war, I don't think the Chinese are naive to why the wars took place in the first place and the US and Western behavior in Ukraine that caused the problem and the issue in the first place. And these are, looking here at this is a statement made by the Chinese president in 2024 regarding China's development and the direction China wants to take in the global environment. This is part of his statement, or the second part of his statement. I put forward the goal of accelerating efforts to boost China's strength in finance at the Central Financial Work Conference. So what does this goal specifically entail? It requires a robust economic foundation, along with world-leading economic strength, scientific and technological capabilities, and composite national strength. In addition, it also encompasses a key set of core financial elements. So China wants to be seen as a powerful economic player on the global level. Not just science, and also economic, scientific, and technological. So it wants to be a major power in the world, in all aspects, really. And in terms of its currency, we should possess a strong currency that is widely used in international trade, investment, and foreign exchange markets with global reserve currency status. So they have that already, but it seems the way they want it to be a major currency in the world, which means it still has a long way to go since it's less than 10% of global trade, used in global trade. Third, we should have strong financial institutions that feature high operational efficiency and risk resilience, provide a comprehensive range of services, and possess global presence and international competitiveness. And number fourth, we should have strong international financial centers that can attract global investors and exert influence over international pricing systems. Well, they have that already through their own business and able to monopolize the export and supply of certain goods. They can have strong influence over the global economy already. Fifth, we should have a strong financial regulation framework that is underpinned by a sound financial legal system and carries significant voice and influence in shaping international financial rules. Yes, they can have that. The West also, or America also has, well, it doesn't. America has rules, but it has a tendency to break the rules. So the enforcement arm in terms of international trade and so forth is dominated by the US, so its players can get away with things that other countries can't get away with. Even though China gets away with it, because China has a tendency to ignore the type of rules that the US tries to enforce. And this is regarding, let me try and organize it so I can read it. These are two aspects of the political side of the relations between Russia and China and what they wanted to gain out of their summit that they had after the Trump and Xi Jinping meeting. For Beijing, stable relations with Moscow secure its northern frontier and reduce the risk of encirclement by hostile powers from the south. Indeed, the part of the purpose of Putin's visit this week is to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation agreed by Putin and Xi's predecessor, President Jiang Zemin. So, them being partners is partly a security matter for them. If you're friendly with your neighbor, then that border between you and your neighbor is secure. Beijing and Moscow both see value in coordinating against what they describe as Western hegemony and unilateralism. Their new communique on multipolarity reflects this shared worldview. The language of a more just and equitable international order is not simply rhetorical flourish. It reflects a long-standing Chinese and Russian effort to weaken the dominance of the US-led institutions and create greater room for alternative centers of power. But the US will see that as a threat. When a country wants to reduce the dominance of the US will see that as a threat to their, not even just their control of the world system, but they see it as a threat to the strength of the US or the US itself, because when the US becomes a weaker nation, or not such an influential nation, or it has less control over the world, some elements of US think this is a way of the US becoming weaker. So that would be seen as a danger to the US, not just the US dominance, the US itself. Anyway, that multipolarity serves different but complementary purposes. Russia views it as a pathway out of isolation and as recognition that it remains a major power. Is it out of isolation? Is Russia really isolated? Maybe from the Western perspective it's isolated, but according to the global South, I don't think Russia is seen as somewhere that is isolated. Or maybe they're talking about isolation from the West. Anyway, Western sanctions and diplomatic pressure. China sees multipolarity as a transition towards a world less centered on American strategic primacy and more accommodating to the Beijing growing economic and political influence. Multipolarity is an environment in which you have several major powers rather than just one major power, like the US is under a unilateral system would be seen, or unipolar system I should say, would be seen as just one dominant power in the world. For example, in terms of the dollar, the US dollar being used in 80% of transactions, almost 80% of transactions, makes it the dominant currency in the world. That's the form of US power, and all the institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth being based in the US, they're seen as, in fact, they were formed by the US. There's a form of control of the US over other countries in the world. So what they want to do basically is introduce, either give more power to other countries within these same systems or formulate new systems themselves, so that the US is not the dominant political and economic power in the world. So this convergence of these concepts of these two countries has produced a durable strategic partnership. China has provided Russia with crucial economic lifelines since the war in the Ukraine began. It has expanded bilateral trade and increased purchases of Russian oil and gas and sustained technological and industrial exchanges, straining its ties with Europe in the process. Europe is caught in the middle between Russia, China, and America. It wants to align with America, being its fellow Western power. But the US wants to see Europe as a minor partner. You see it as a partner, yes, but not as an equal partner, a minor partner. And if Europe expands into Eastern Europe, that expands Europe itself, thus expanding the power of the US. So in some ways, yes, Europe is a partner to the US, but it's a partner that the US it doesn't want Europe to become too powerful that it will be a competitor to the US in terms of influence over other parts of Asia. So that is the US agenda in Europe. Even though it wants to give European countries more say in NATO over what's happening in Ukraine, for example, this current president wanted European countries to invest more in NATO's military hardware than they had been investing, because America had been investing something like 80% of the finances into NATO. But these countries are forced to increase their revenue contribution into NATO. So it's also part of this, was it Project 2025 Heritage Foundation document. It wanted Europe, if you read the document, it wants Europe to contribute more to NATO and take more responsibility in terms of the war in Ukraine, for example. The US wants to pull out, not completely, but it wants to give a bigger role of European countries in what NATO does, specifically in their region. Anyway, let's look at what Russia and China got out of their meeting, their recent summit. Looking at the history of relations between Russia and America, I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't mention, how the communist powers took over Russia. Most people don't realize that, but it was funded by the US, as I'll read here. The top communist leaders have never been as hostile to their counterparts in the West as the rhetoric suggests. They are quite friendly to the world's leading financiers and have worked closely with them when it suits their purposes. As we shall see in the following section, the Bolshevik Revolution actually was financed by wealthy financiers in London and New York. Lenin and Trotsky were on the closest of terms with these moneyed interests both before and after the revolution. These hidden liaisons have continued to this day and occasionally pop up to the surface when we discover that David Rockefeller's holding confidential meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev in the absence of government sponsorship or diplomatic purpose. So they met on the sidelines basically somewhere. It wasn't an official meeting. One of the greatest myths of contemporary history is that the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was a popular uprising of the downtrodden masses against the hated ruling class of the Tsars. As we shall see, however, the planning, the leadership, and especially the financing came entirely from outside Russia, mostly from financiers in Germany, Britain, and the United States. And it also mentions here that somehow the Rothschilds played a role in this also. So the Russian Revolution, which brought in communism, was financed, planned, And even the leadership of this so-called revolution came from the West. So you have to ask the question as to whether communism was really an enemy of the West, or was it a tool of Western domination? But then you ask, how would it be a tool of Western domination if the ideology itself was so opposed to the West? Maybe that's the very reason that it was introduced. It was introduced by the West as an ideology, as an alternative ideology to their main ideology. So people would now follow this as an alternative, what they perceive to be an alternative to the West. But in reality, it was creating the alternatives that the West wanted the rest of the world to have. So you control the thinking of the people by giving them an alternative to what you're doing. So in a sense, you can control whatever alternative the people would introduce in opposition to your ideology. If you put it there yourself, then you know what people are going to be thinking, and you can control what people end up doing by creating how the opposition behaves. So you'll still be in control of the full situation if you're controlling both sides, basically. Anyway, this is looking at the global. It's from the book The Grand Chessboard by this Brezinski. He was the strategic advisor to a former president, US president, I can't remember his name. It is reasonable to conclude that the American primacy on the Eurasian continent will be buffeted by turbulence and perhaps, at least by sporadic violence. America's primacy is potentially vulnerable to new challenges, either from regional contenders or novel constellations. The currently dominant American global system, within which the threat of war is off the table, is likely to be stable. It's off the table because basically they think that the US military is the strongest in the world, so it's not under threat from any kind of military altercation. Although they have had wars. Look at Vietnam, South Korea, and even Iran today. They've gone to war with countries, but the US hasn't really won. They've won militarily, but they haven't achieved their goal. So even in Iran, they have not achieved their goal. They say they've decimated their military. The ultimate aim was perceived to be the overthrowing of the government, bringing in a new government that is friendly to them, but they failed to do that. They failed to completely decimate the military. Even their nuclear capabilities in Iran, we don't know how much has been destroyed. We know that they secured it underground in places which the US military probably couldn't reach, even though they're claiming that they've destroyed the whole nuclear system. But they've failed to achieve their main goal in toppling the Iranian regime. Anyway, let me continue with this. As I was saying, the currently dominant American global system, within which the threat of war is off the table, is likely to be stable. To be stable only in those parts of the world in which American primacy guided by a long-term geostrategy rests on compatible and congenial socio-political systems linked together by American-dominated multilateral framework. Basically, America is dominant and remaining control in areas of the world where their systems are still dominant, or where they dominate the economic, social systems like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. These are all American-dominated systems. But what's happening with the BRICS is they're creating their own economic systems or financial systems, which are not necessarily to counter, but they provide alternatives to these Western American-dominated systems, even though they're still small at the moment, because even these systems to some extent depend on the dollar. But they'll increase in time, but it won't be in the next 10 years or so. Maybe 20 to 30 years you'll see a difference in the global economy in terms of how much the American dollar is used. But as long as these systems are still strong for the US, then it still has some level of dominance over the global economy and political system. Even though there are systems which the US is not part of, like these International Criminal Court and International Criminal Court, the Court of Justice. So even though they're under the jurisdiction of these bodies, because these bodies cover crimes around the world, international crimes around the world, crimes of humanity, I should say, around the world. So US leaders and members of US citizenry can be taken to the court. Potentially, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China and Russia and perhaps Iran. Well, China and Russia are now in coalition. Are they really a threat to the US? They're a threat in terms of pulling other countries away from the US or providing an alternative to the US dominance of the financial systems. As I mentioned, they're forming different systems, different payment systems. I know Russia has formed one, China has formed different payment systems that they can use for international trade with other countries. BRICS is also forming a system. They could form an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology but by complementary grievances. It would be reminiscent in scale and scope of the challenge once posed by the Sino-Soviet bloc. But the Sino-Soviet bloc in particular was formed by the US. So is it really a threat? So does that mean now that China and Russia are not really as much of a threat? They seem a threat in public, but in reality they're not so much a threat to the US, to the global system at least, as we're giving the impression. So it goes on to say, though this time China would likely be the leaders, well, China is much more economically powerful than Russia. So basically it's saying, you have to wonder why, looking back at this Bolshevik issue that I mentioned a while ago, if the Americans and the Western powers in particular allowed or even pushed for this communist ideology to take over Russia, was it just to create a different ideology which it had some level of control of? Because the intellectuals that formed these different communist ideologies, some of them spent time in the West. They were funded by the West, as I said. So who is really the challenger in the world, you have to ask, if ideologies are created by the West to challenge the West and on the surface yet. Communists fell. I think communists failed as a system generally because the West created it to fail. And it failed in, was it 89, 90? You'd have to study and find out why it failed. And at that particular time, was it formulated to fail by the West, not simply because it's an opposing system that the West wanted to fail, or was it just a tool that was supposed to be there for a time, and its time to end came at the end of 1989, 1990. Anyway, that's a look at what's happening with China, Russia, and the US, and their political and economic systems, and how the US, to some extent, is still dominant economically, but it's losing control, losing that dominance. But then again, it's up to the countries to allow whether the US should be dominant. Countries can change their political systems or the way they behave in order to benefit themselves, even though they may come under pressure from the US. China is one of the, I wouldn't say it's one of the examples, because China was helped to develop by the US in terms of sharing technologies and helping to build its manufacturing base by American companies moving to China and setting up manufacturing in partnership with Chinese companies. So that helped China to develop. And this is something that you could almost say was mirrored in several East Asian countries. It's almost as if you could argue that the West wanted East Asia to develop in ways that it didn't want other areas of the world to develop. Anyway, that's a look at the relationship between these countries. That's it for now.